start us, because we want every moment we can have of Joy's wisdom and beauty shared with us. So I'm going to turn the program at this moment over to Miriam Karp, who's going to lead us in a brief Havdalah, because we are moving into the week.
Okay, so somewhere in the world, 3 stars are visible, not in Atlanta, but we're going to pretend. Okay, so. Ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya da ya da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya da da da. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Borei peri hagafen, borei peri hagafen. Ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da da da. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Borei mine v'samim, borei mine v'samim. Ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da da da. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Borei meorei ha'esh, borei meorei ha'esh. Ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da da da. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Hamavdil ben kodesh lecho, ben or lechoshech. Ben Yisrael le'ami, ben yom hashvihi, v'sheshet yamei hamaseh. Baruch atah Adonai, hamavdil ben kodesh lecho. La ya ya da 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 ya 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 da 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 da. Ya 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 da 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 ya 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 da da da. Word. Shavua tov, 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 Shavua tov. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Bimhera ve'amenu, Yavo Eleinu, Imashiach ben David, Imashiach ben David, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi.
Shavua Tov, Yasher Koach. Thank you so much, Miriam. Lovely way to start our evening. Here's what's going to happen, folks, from here on out. I'm going to call upon Alan Sugar, our beloved local member poet, to introduce Joy Ladin for this poetry reading and discussion. Joy is going to read poems and tell us about them and add framing and context for the poetry that she shares. When she is done with that, we'll have time for questions and answers, and I will moderate that. So, Alan Sugar, take it away. You have to unmute.
Okay. I just saw that message. All right. Thank you, Rabbi Dale, and welcome to all. When two lovers embrace, for one moment, the world stands still. And in that one moment, everyone has a place. It is a delight for me to introduce our guest this evening. As Cole Porter might say, it's delightful, it's the lovely, it's the Ladin. Joy Ladin is a nationally recognized speaker on gender and Jewish identity. She is a widely published essayist, poet, and literary scholar. Tonight, Joy's presentation is entitled Wrestling with Human and Divine, Poems from Shekinah Speaks, Psalms, and the Book of Anna. Joy has earned many well-deserved honors and accolades. The Book of Anna was recently selected as a winner of the 2022 National Book Award for Poetry. In 2016, she won a creative writing grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. She has also received 2 Hadassah Brandeis Research Fellowships. And my mother, Angela Sugar, was a member of Hadassah. Joy was selected as both a Lambda Literary Award and Triangle Award finalist for The Soul of the Stranger, Reading God and Torah from a Transgender Perspective. She was also selected as a Lambda Award finalist for her poetry collections Transmigration and Impersonation. Her memoir, Through the Door of Life, A Jewish Journey Between Genders, was a 2012 National Book Award finalist. You can find more about Joy's life and work at joyladin.wordpress.com, along with her dynamic and engaging online conversations containing multitudes on jewishlive.org. Joy has also been featured on NPR programs, including On Being with Krista Tippett. Joy holds the David and Ruth Gottesman Chair in English at Stern College of Yeshiva University. Notably, Joy Ladin is the first openly transgender employee of an Orthodox institution. And now, some thoughts of my own. Transgender people deserve our admiration and respect. It is a metaphor for life itself, the journey that we each take toward a sense of identity and self-actualization. I think of the psychologist Abraham Maslow and his model of human needs. Self-actualization is near the very top of the pyramid. But above self-actualization, at the very pinnacle, is a stage that he defines as transcendence. And there it is, transcendence. The prefix trans is rooted in the Latin meaning across, over, and beyond. And there it is, across, over, and beyond. It is the key that opens the door to a technicolor garden, releasing us from a repressive world of sepia-tinted, monochromatic gray. I wonder if there is such a place. There must be. And isn't it delightful and lovely to know that Joy Ladin is lighting the way? And now with much joy, we welcome the readings of your poetry tonight. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. That was wonderful. And I am usually the one making terrible puns, so I am particularly grateful. And I'm going to tell my wife about this because she's always hitting me when I make puns. I want her to know it's not just me. Um, and I love your reading of trans, and of course, it reminds me that Ivri, Ivrim also seems to be connected to the same root, those who pass over. I don't know that it has the beyond quality to it, but thank you. I'm going to do something that I've never quite done before. I want to um, take you through sort of like a spiritual autobiography in poetry. So, not quite a spiritual autobiography, but when I finished my latest book, Shekhinah Speaks, which is coming out on Wednesday, God willing, um, I realized that it was the culmination of a trilogy, really, that had started with the Book of Anna. When I wrote the Book of Anna, I was not thinking about it this way. There was a whole lot of stuff that was going on in it, but I knew that one of my preoccupations was to where the parts where Anna was talking about God. And some years after that book was written, I found myself writing Psalms in the Davidic mode of kvetching a lot. I don't ask God to kill my enemies. I didn't go full David, um, but a lot of intimate kvetching. And then when I started writing Shekhinah Speaks, I was kind of missing the energy of language that was in those earlier books. I wasn't really thinking of them as connected. But now I realize that this is a three different perspectives on the human-divine relationship. And I've never tried to put it together that way before. So it's kind of a lot of stops along the way, and um, I'm definitely looking forward to talking with you about it afterwards. So I'm going to start with the Book of Anna. Um, Anna is a fictional character. She's a Czech German Jewish woman writing in 1950s Prague after surviving an adolescence in the concentration camp. And she's a very difficult person. When I wrote Anna, I had really grown up with this fairly repressive idea of the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors as in some way being like the best thing you could do as a Jew would be to have died in the Holocaust because that made you sort of all the pinnacle of virtuousness and martyrdom, and actually being a living Jew couldn't come close. And Anna is not me. Actually, she started with a voice in my head that I didn't recognize. She's really a different person, and she is not a nice person, as I think you'll see right off the bat. So she is quite messed up from her time in the camps. She was a designated survivor. The people who kept her alive all gave their lives for her. And she has survival guilt and rage and all kinds of issues. And she's trying to figure out how to tell her story. And she's doing that through poems, but also through these diary entries about the writing of the poems. I'm going to read you the first section of the middle poem of the book is called Song of Songs, 8 Sessions with Dr. Solomon. And each of the chapters takes its imagery from the corresponding chapter of the Song of Songs. And Anna has only one friend. I think when you're a receptionist for the secret police, it's hard to make friends, a fellow survivor. And this survivor, unlike Anna, seems to have come through fairly well adjusted. Yeah, but she knows Anna is in trouble, and she's been trying to get Anna to see a therapist and Dr. Solomon is the therapist that Anna goes to see. But before reading that, I want to read you a bit of a diary entry where she's reflecting on the Song of Songs and why she's drawn to using it. I plan to keep reading that song made of songs. It's become a favorite, not just because of the sex, because God is so utterly absent that the rabbis decided, what else could they do, to see him everywhere, as shepherd and king and leaping gazelle, his lonely rose of Sharon, his maiden Israel, wooed from every side at once, ripening like a cluster of dates just beyond his grasp, lying awake all night, radiating perfume from between her breasts. Black but comely, most beautiful of women, she somehow thinks, that's the nerve of this girl, this allegory of devotion and abandonment, that she's entitled not only to her beloved's love, but to the love of the rest of the harem. She wheedles their apples and bits of bread, cries on their shoulders, faints in their arms, screams for their protection. In the final chapters, when she's made her escape, she has the gall to survive them. So the epigraph of the poem is the famous quote from Song of Songs, love is strong as death, craving as the grave. Anna, among other things that she's talking with Dr. Solomon about, is Anna is kind of compelled to have sex with men, violent sex, in which she's clearly acting some stuff out. So there's references to that. But this is her first session, so you'll recognize imagery from the first chapter. And she's talking directly to Dr. Solomon, so you have the privilege of being in Anna's therapy session. Yes, doctor, the same dream. The harem, bags of myrrh between their breasts, henna tattoos on their wrists, the terminally noble daughters of Barracks 10, who made the suicide pact to husband me as their vineyard, doctor, their designated fruit, the shoot they'd plant beyond the camps. He must be here, they murmur. His scent is growing stronger. The Rebbitzin trembles like a veil. The physicist giggles. The whore straightens her hem. It's a tense moment, doctor. God returning to the harem to kiss us with the kisses of his mouth, stud us with gold, shower us with silver, lay us on couches of leaves between panels of cypresses. The Rebbitzin was right. The whore was a dangerous influence. The others shunned her. With me, she could reminisce. Soft Jewish boys, firemen, lawyers, grandfathers with whiskey on their breath. It was a living, doctor. No guns, no boots, just small dark rooms, need and nakedness. After every tete-a-tete, the Rebbitzin would mutter supplications to shield me. She was serious, doctor, from growing up like that. Is this too much for a first session, doctor? You're looking a little pale. Your predecessor accused me of using his office to violate the dead. He was no Solomon, doctor. It isn't that easy to violate daughters of Barracks 10. In your professional opinion, doctor, what do I owe them? For the physicist, a skeptical smile? Kinder for the Rebbitzin? For the whore, a steady job and steadier diet of men? And for the king whose name is like perfume, unspeakably intimate, who has brought me to your couch to recount what the Rebbitzin called his merciful deliverance? Where was I, doctor? Oh, yes, the dream, the harem, myrrh, the footfalls of his nibs. I take my place between whore and Rebbitzin, blink and have no lids. My jaws keep moving, the chant goes on, but my mouth is full of flesh. I'm eating my way across a face familiar, immense. I have no hands, no skin, hidden wings, a sweet tooth for the dead. A scarab beetle. Yes, uncanny, doctor, a truly inspired guest. black but comely, part Rebbitzin, part whore, consummate physicist, living tribute, doctor, to the daughters of Barracks 10. Return, isn't that what you call it? Return on their investment. How can you hide from what never goes away? No, doctor, not Heraclitus. I'm quoting the Rebbitzin. The physicist loved to needle her in the dark after last inspection. God this, God that, sotto voce blasphemies that had us all in stitches. Usually the Rebbitzin obliged by begging heaven to forgive a soul made foolish by torment. The whore would snicker, quick, or he'll sentence her to a concentration camp. The physicists snort as though some theorem had just been demonstrated. This time, the Rebbitzin rattled them. How can you hide from what never goes away, she asked. That's the question, isn't it, doctor, in the harem of the dead, where a god whose love is stronger than wine and kinkier than the Rebbitzin admitted, sniffs among his women, selecting me for scarab's chittens, the daughters of Barracks 10, to hold his favorite poses, love, sacrifice, forgiveness. Tell me, you whom my soul loveth, where thou feedest, where thou restest thy flocks at noon. I eat my way from temple to temple. The king leans back on the bed. My jaws tire of opening and closing. Moonlight glints on my carapace. So, I want you to know that Anna makes a lot of progress by the 8th session, but she's clearly got some things to work out there, and one of them that I want to focus on is her very complicated relation to God. When I started the project and I realized that Anna was going to do this with sacred text, she refused to tell her story in poems unless there was some Jewish text that she was messing with and forcing. And I realized that that was partly a reflection of my sense that I needed to see if Jewish tradition could really stand up to the Holocaust. Not just the idea of God, but the whole tradition. Does it still have meaning and resonance when it's used to voice some of the, the most horrible things that we've experienced? Anna is not asking that question. She's really a nihilist at this point. She feels like the answer is no. Jewish tradition does not stand up. She doesn't think anything that human beings have come up with really holds water after what she's been through. But one problem that Anna doesn't have is she didn't experience the Holocaust as the absence of God. She experienced it as you can see in this poem. The horrible thing was that God was present in the middle of all of this, and she's trying to figure out what does this mean to have a relationship with a God who is actually there in the midst of this. How do you understand it? And she's angry, she's sarcastic, she feels violated, but she also longs for that presence. There's some kind of connection that she persists in having, even though she doesn't believe in anything, she can't escape the sense of God's presence. And it isn't until the end of the poem that she realizes that these three very different women who gave their lives to keep her alive did it out of love, and that in some way they reflect what is alive at the heart of this tradition that she's questioning. So I wouldn't say it's a happy ending. It's certainly not too happy for Dr. Solomon, because she never stops making fun of him all the way through the poem. But she does realize to her astonishment that she was loved and that she is capable of love, that she loved them back. And so these difficult sessions become a turning point in her path back to humanity. As the book continued, Anna's other big issue, because, like the concentration camp thing isn't enough, her other big issue is her mother. She's really angry at her mother, who she feels abandoned her, who left her with a non-Jewish family, and then was arrested and died herself in a different camp. And as the book is going on, I'm like, Anna, I want to write more about the God stuff. I'm really interested in the God stuff. And Anna was, no, this is not about God. This is about my mother. I've got to work out my mother. So, so I didn't. My theological cravings were not satisfied by Anna. That book was the last thing that I wrote while I was still living as a man, and it was published originally. It was republished last year, but originally it was published under the initial J, because by the time it was being published, I realized that I wasn't going to be able to maintain living as a man, but I wasn't out yet, and Anna was gave me this valuable lesson in terms of imagining what it might mean to live as a woman. Not because Anna was anything like me or like what I would become, but actually just because she was so different than one of the problems with growing up in the closet is you don't get to really develop your identity. You don't get to develop who you are. So I had all these undeveloped ideas about what it would mean to live as a woman. And Anna just blew them all out of the water. She does not care about being nice. She is not taking care of anyone's feelings. She's incredibly smart. She's not disguising it. She's not trying to sugarcoat anything. What she really, really is herself. And I felt like that was something that Anna was teaching me, that it was going to take me years of living as myself to realize that gender transition wasn't about becoming a woman. It was about becoming me in the fullest sense. So I did that thing. I became me in the fullest sense, and it didn't go so well at first. I have to say there was a lot of loss that was associated with it. My marriage broke up, and I wasn't able to live with my children, and I was housing insecure, and then I got really sick, and I was trying to meet somebody through the internet. I was very lonely, so that was pretty horrible. I don't know if anybody else here has had computer dating experience, but yeah, Amy, look at Amy's face. That was it. That was exactly it. So I was in a very, very low place. And then this illness, which was not diagnosed, kept getting worse and worse. And part of it was aphasia. I would lose the ability to use language and even like think in language. And that was getting worse every day. And I thought, I had better write whatever it is I have to write, because I don't know how long I'm going to be able to do this. So I asked myself, what is it that I need to write if this is it? And I realized that it was Psalms. I wanted to write poems that were directly addressed to God, on that model of the Davidic Psalms, where there's a lot of raw human emotion, a lot of ups and downs and despair and reversals, and great poetry. I wanted to do that for a couple of reasons. One is that when I was growing up, as I was saying last night, God was the only person, when I would talk to God and I would say God was the only person who knew what I meant. When I started writing poetry as myself, I thought I would start being able to be as self-obsessed as every other American poet and write all these poems in the first person, which I'd previously shied away from because I knew the first person would be misunderstood. But I couldn't do it because I didn't know who I was. So part of what drew me to writing Psalms was I wanted to write poems where I could speak to somebody who, as myself, as my full self, who really knew who that was. So in addressing God, I was learned to say I in poetry. The other reason was I live in a very beautiful area, and it was a painfully beautiful summer. So, which is great, but when you're sick and you're looking at this extraordinary blooming world outside the window, and it's summer and everybody seems to be happy in your imagination, and you're feeling awful, it's quite easy to feel alone and abandoned and sorry for yourself. And it's not that I felt that God wasn't there. I just felt like God was busy blooming instead of paying attention to what the ruler of the universe should be paying to, which was how miserable I was. I mean, really, do you have something that's more important to think about? No. So I wanted to write these poems as a way of forcing God into intimate proximity with my situation. I was going to talk to God in a way that God had no choice but to listen. God, however, is tricky, and I will explain how that works later. So there are 3 sections in this book that reflect 3 different moments in this relationship. I'm going to read a couple of poems from each section. You scare me the way I scare the rabbit in my path. I freeze, brown eye fixed on your approaching shadow. Sometimes you rip me to shreds, sometimes squeeze till my ribs crack. Always you watch me bleed and blossom curiously from a distance, as though I were a furry blur of terror, frozen between surrender and the urge to disappear into the undergrowth of forever. You'll scare me to death you'll scare me to one death or another if you come closer. You come closer. I smell you on my clothes, my books, the toys my children scatter, my 2 or 3 private parts devoted solely to radiating pain, my organs of need and pleasure. Why do you bother to provoke this terror in something small and unimportant that asks nothing but to be allowed to vanish? Why do you bother with us at all when your being is bounded by no conditions but absolute freedom and absolute distance from the bits of bone and truth that come closer and closer to freezing, the closer we come to you? This is the next psalm. It's a bit of a midrash. The footsteps of the Lord in the garden. I know the drill. I pull on my skin and try to act human, knowing you've already noticed the difference between the creature I am and the creature you thought you were breathing yourself into on the 6th day at evening. I know you will clothe my nakedness, tender but also disappointed that I need to feel something other than naked, when nakedness is the image in which I was created, the image I see through your see-through robe of shy young stars that sing very quietly so as not to drown your image singing inside them. You want me to see you picking your way through the garden of my body. You try so hard to be seen. I try so hard not to be one of your hopes staring hungrily through the leaves. I talk to you incessantly, but you can count on the fingers of the hand you don't have the times I've heard you answer. Occasionally, I'm blinded by your beauty. One blink, and the reassuring lids of life close over you again. Now I have no life to lid the terrifying continent of your longing to meet a gaze that meets your gaze, naked and unashamed, an image of you that can stand the sight of the image it was made in. So, cliff notes here. I'm not a happy camper. I am trying to use these poems to stage close encounters with God, and I'm actually freaked out because God turns out to be there. And then I get even more freaked out because the longings and feelings that I have are being answered by a being that has longings and feelings of their own, which is something that I'm not expecting. And in fact, and this is the the trickiness of God when you want to pick a fight with God. What I discovered was, remember, I wrote the poems thinking I was sort of forcing God into intimacy with me. But the more of these psalms I wrote, the more I realized I was winding up in intimacy with God and being forced to re-examine myself from God's perspective, when what I was trying to do was make God take a good look in the mirror through my perspective. So yes, extremely underhanded of God, but characteristic. So in the second section, I'm realizing that the whole just raging against the machine thing has been turned around, and that I'm now in an intimate relationship with God. And I'm trying to figure out how this works and what I'm doing there. This is one of those poems. You're right. I should stop thinking, because when I think, I can't understand what we're doing together. You with your blameless beauty thickening in my window, terrible as an army, called in to guard or pacify a restive population. Me, dying of, well, it's hard to say, but certainly dying, because that's the way you made me. Built-in obsolescence that can't stop complaining, even when you're slipping through my window in search of peace and quiet, and a warm, imperfect body to ease the burden of the beauty of things that never die, because that's the way you made them. But you didn't make me not to think, and I can't think without thinking about what we're doing together. You with your undying beauty, and me with the ugliness of thoughts you think I shouldn't, because then it will never make sense. You being here, flooding my ugliness with your beauty, as though beauty were some kind of justification for the death that, if only I would stop thinking, would start making sense. I don't know about you, but for me, the whole death thing has always been a real obstacle in my relationship with God. It's very hard to, it's a non-negotiable thing. You can ask for all kinds of things, but this is something you just shouldn't bother praying for, not dying or not having other people ever die. It's just not going to work that way. And so as I'm in this relationship with a being that just doesn't, for whom mortality and time and space are not conditions, and I was feeling so mortal, it really was confusing to figure out what I was doing there, but really, what is God doing here? Like, what is God getting out of this relationship? Not that I was worried about God playing the field or anything, but I was a puzzlement for me. But things kept progressing, and this is a poem that concludes that stage in the relationship. You are making me now, right now, the clay of me warm in your hands, the hands of me warmed by your hands that shape them, shape a heart that's never been beaten, skin that shivers in secret places, places that will never be touched, except by the maker hunched patiently over the stupidity of matter, leaving your mark between my eyes, my hips, in the clay turning slowly in your hands, blinking a little in your light, as I learn to forget the tenderness you reveal in the act of making, to confuse the feeling of your fingers moving inside me with smaller, less luminous fingers, that will never reach as deep, whose love will never make me something that can think, can suffer, as your love, finger by finger, is making me now. So by the end of that poem, I'm sort of getting the message that this is a package deal, that getting to be created, getting to be a being who is created, means being able to think and being able to suffer, and that that's all in some way part of the fingers of love that are shaping me. The last section are efforts to live happily ever after. And frankly, we never quite ride off into the sunset together, but there is a kind of reconciliation. And I just want to read one poem of that. It's time the soul you planted in the soil of this unhappy body learned to love you without scratching, to recognize and melt beneath the kisses you disguise as bitterness and licorice whips and galaxies of glimmering suns dangling in drops from dripping leaves. It's time for you to plant me among your dripping leaves, and time for me to glimmer there in ecstasy, time for you to make me an instrument of your beauty, and time for me to play the music of you that can only be made of and through the holes you make in me. So, unfortunately, I'm closing out the whole kvetching option here. And I learned to write poems in the first person. I got my say. I didn't let God get a word in edgewise. That's a lot of poems in that book. God does not get to say anything. And some years went by, and I really grew into myself. Transition was not an issue for me. There were other things that I was concerned about. And I got an odd invitation to a symposium of embodied Judaism. And when I saw that I was being invited to participate in a symposium of embodied Judaism, I thought, you clearly have the wrong impression, because no one knows less about embodied Judaism than me. Like dissociated Judaism, I'm your girl. But embodied Judaism, I don't think so. But they wooed me because this was the focus of it was the Shekhinah. And I thought that sounded really cool. So I went back over my poems, and I'd written a couple of Shekhinah poems in my first book, and there was a poem which wasn't a Shekhinah poem, but I could fake it because, it could work both ways. And, but I thought, that feels like cheating to just read old work. Why don't I try actually writing Shekhinah poems? And why don't I try writing in the voice of the Shekhinah? This is something that American poets do. We write what are called persona poems. Write in the voice of your favorite chair. What would your favorite chair say if it could speak to you? This is fun to do, by the way. You don't have to be a poet in order to do it. It's a blast. And I thought, yeah, why don't I write in the voice of the Shekhinah? After all, I've done all this thinking about God. I'm highly qualified. I've got 2 advanced degrees. I don't think God has any advanced degrees. And I have firm ideas about how to run the universe. So yeah, let me give it a shot. What could go wrong? And in fact, I had a marvelous time speaking in the voice of the Shekhinah and giving everybody what for in her voice. And I read it. It was a very supportive, creative environment. Everybody was happy. And I thought, that was easy to write these poems. This is great. I'm always looking, never works out this way, but I'm always looking for a book that I can write quickly, so then I can be prolific. And I thought, yeah, I knocked out a couple of these poems right off the bat. Let me just go back to them. But in the meantime, I had written The Soul of the Stranger, which included a lot of thinking about cognitive idolatry, as I was talking about last night. And when I went back to those Shekhinah poems, I thought, oh, this is the poetic equivalent of idolatry. I've actually made a little tiny image of divinity that coincidentally fits my ideas perfectly. It flatters everything that I think. Instead of a relationship with God summoning me to become larger, I've shrunk God down to a size and really turned God into a sock puppet. Oh, I'm the creator of the universe. Hi. So I realized I can't do that. And I also realized that writing Psalms, as satisfying as it was to force God to listen to my endless monologues, I was really wondering what God would say in response. And then I realized I'm really hungry for that voice, that divine voice. And one of the things about the Shekhinah is she's a product of, I guess, a 1,000-year version of a one-night stand between Jewish theological imagination and the gender binary. So Jews had this problem with a male-identified God who is transcendent and distant from actual human experience. And the rabbis developed the concept of the Shekhinah really to fill that gap, to give Jews who are suffering in exile tremendously a way to think about God as present. And the gender binary gave them the perfect thing, because the gender binary says if you've got a male something, you also need to have a female something, which is the opposite but lesser. So the subordinate complement of that. So God talks all the time, the Shekhinah doesn't say anything. God sends Israel into exile, the Shekhinah goes into exile with the Jews. God causes suffering, the Shekhinah suffers. But the Shekhinah, it's not all bad for the Shekhinah, because the Shekhinah is also the part of God, the immanent aspect of God that that is present in each of our lives. The Shekhinah, we're told, goes to our weddings and dances and rejoices when we rejoice and weeps when we weep. So the Shekhinah is a part of God. And imagine this, that this is part of God's job, to be actually a witness to everything that you are feeling and thinking. Everything. What a trip, right? They would have to pay me a lot of money to do that with the entire human race. But that is the Shekhinah's job. So as I was developing the project, I thought, screw this silent part. I want to hear what the Shekhinah has to say. And then I had to learn how to give her a voice. I didn't want to just make her a sock puppet, because I'd been there, done that. It wasn't a good thing to do. So I realized I needed to turn my poetry over to her. I needed to make poems out of words that weren't mine so that her voice could emerge. And I thought, I need some certified God language. So I looked at the chapters of, it's called Second Isaiah. Isaiah from chapter 40 onward is one of the greatest poets in human history. And Isaiah, for the first 40 chapters, is really not a great writer. Not as bad as Ezekiel, but not so good. And God has really great monologues in Isaiah. So I thought, I'm going to sample words from those monologues. So I'll have certified God words in there. But mushing those words around didn't create a female aspect of divinity. That's what the Shekhinah is. She's marked as female. So I knew I had to mix those words with other kinds of words. So I thought, I'm going to look for Cosmopolitan magazine articles that resonate in some way with the stuff in Isaiah. And then I thought, well, that is insane. that's ridiculous. I felt like this idea was given to me. I thought, there's no way that there's anything in Cosmopolitan that has anything to do with Second Isaiah. So I went to the website with one of my favorite quotes from Isaiah, "Sing out, O barren one who has not given birth," which I've always related to as a trans woman. And I typed in barren, and the first thing that came up was why this woman is proud to be known as the pageant queen without a uterus. And I thought, if the Cosmo website can be seen as a source of divine communication, I believe I have just gotten the thumbs up. The Shekhinah is, we think of her as queen. She's queen without a uterus. She's seen as female, even though she's not biologically female. It was like, okay, this is a go. So I wanted to read you some poems from Shekhinah Speaks. And I learned something of how she sees us. So because she sees us from the inside out, we look very similar to her because we all have the same kinds of feelings and struggles and fears. So she's talking to us, each of us, all the time, but she only needs one pronoun. She just says you. And by that you in these poems, she means each individual person. So here's some of what she's saying to you. Stillborn. You're still being born, still trying to understand what you are and where I am, inside or outside, attached or disattached. Still digging, still scraping, still filling with time, still buried, still growing, still waiting to be delivered. I know. I'm the neighbor who's always watching, the teacher who's sometimes kind, the mother who sees how hungry you are, the doctor who makes you sick. Sometimes I stagger you with terror, but I also cover your body with flowers, pinks and sweetheart roses. When they wilt, I remain, before you're born, and there in the casket, you are still my favorite color, a cloud I continue to ride even when you're no longer moving, a love into which I keep falling even when you're no one, nothing, stillborn or miscarried. I still surround you like a uterus, and you are still my baby. One of the things that I learned about the Shekhinah is that she doesn't exist in time, which makes it, like she just sees every moment of our lives simultaneously. And so in these poems, she's like all over the place. The end of our lives and the beginning of our lives are happening simultaneously for her, which meant that when we had this little conversation about death, and she was like, what is the big deal with you people in death? When you walk to the end of the street, do you feel like the street has died behind you? And we just had to agree to disagree on that one. I mean, I get that it's not a big deal for her, but it continues to be a big deal for me. So this poem is kind of about that. It's called Melting Away, and the epigraph from Isaiah is, you say to yourself, I am, and there is no one besides me. And the Cosmo article is, the scary, scary way your friends are losing weight. I sit in the stubble of your heart, listening to you say, I am. I am, you say, and there is no one besides me, by which you mean no one to remember, no one to love your wise and childish, tender, obsessive, intermittent selves, melting together, melting away. I am, I say, but you don't hear me. On good days, you wish I were there. On better days, you crave me. On the best days, you feel me sitting amidst the brokenness of your body, your strange shiny pleasures and cardiac butterflies, lifting the veil of your darkness, setting your dust on fire. I am, I say, and there is no one besides me. And for a moment you know it's me, it's you I'm calling, that I am the love into which you're falling, evaporating, one I am at a time, the part of you, the only part, that isn't melting away. So in the first section, those poems come from, the Shekhinah is talking to a you that she knows doesn't hear her. She's like trying to be heard. In the second section, there's more of an interaction. She's been able to come out to the human you, and now it's a more complicated relationship. This is called "Come, Let Us Reason Together," and actually, I wanted to read it partly because of the question about the Leviticus verse. The Shekhinah is kind of addressing that question. Your head is sick, your heart is sick, bruised from your soul to your crown. You hide your devastation under your clothes, even though I'm right here, replacing the poisons in your blood with my oxygen. I know what you've done and haven't, where you like to be touched, and why you think you should be punished. But don't confuse me with conceptions of God that sneak between your body and soul and shame what I delight in. I'm not a conception of God. I'm a burning city, a moon full of blood, a wound to be washed, soothed, protected. You think I come to you for sex? You're an angel I make in the snow, a prayer I offer, a trauma I bear, because you can't live without me, and I want you to live. Sometimes you see me in the mirror, sometimes in your bed. Sometimes I'm a thread you follow back to the pleasure I take in the body, your body, I made to be a festival and a feast, a booth in a cucumber field outside the structures of oppression that hold you, rear you, put you to sleep, rape you through your clothes. Come, let us reason together. Stop doing evil, start doing good, learn to tell one from the other. You are born to burn for justice as a garden burns for water. That's why I come night after night, so you and I can burn for justice together. Do you have it in you to hear another couple, or are you all getting burned out? I can keep going? Okay. This is a poem that it's called Shame, and it has a Southern connection. The Cosmo article is, I had an abortion in Alabama and my neighbors shamed me. That took the words from that. But for me, it also had an LGBTQ connection because shame is so much part of so many of our lives. The Isaiah quote, I feel like, is right on point. God says, woe to the one who says to a father, what have you begotten? Or to a mother, what have you brought to birth? Shame. Ashamed of what you are and aren't, you struggle to stay connected, part of the family, part of the culture that sometimes makes you feel like a monster, telling yourself you're the opposite of brave, that whatever you are is the opposite of what I meant to make. How dare you question what I create? Your shame and your panic, your sex and your rage, where you're broken and where you break, I bore them, I bear them, I open the gates of privilege and stigma so even you can see the image, my image, in which you are created. You can hide from everyone, child, but you can't hide from me. I'm your calamity and your queen, the truth from which there's no protection, the heaven that stretches equally over victory and shame. I foretold you long ago, declared to the ends of the earth, I would be your potter, and you would be my clay. A storehouse I'd fill with treasure, a habitation for my name. Matter fashioned into revelation, a cloud from which I reign. I think that there's a weird connection between the Shekhinah and Anna. and that connection is that they both really take no prisoners. Like one of my first notes when I asked myself, how does the Shekhinah speak? And I realized the answer was any way she wants to. And um, she's what Marcia Falk calls an autonomous female. She's not female in a way that's defined by the gender binary. She doesn't avoid anything in order to, conform to somebody else's ideas. And also her idea of love, I mean, she just takes no prisoners. It's a lot of very tough love because, like I say, she sees us from the inside out, and she feels like her best bet of connecting with us is showing us that all the stuff that we think is coming between us and God, that's not an issue at all. She sees all of it. She's got all of it. She's holding all of it. So a big part of what she does in these poems is she tries to name the human you because she's trying to prove to us that she really knows us, because she's trying to prove to us that she really is us and that we really are her. This is another of those attempts. The Isaiah quote is, "To the eunuchs who choose what pleases me, I will give within my temple and its walls a memorial and a name." And the Cosmo article, well worth reading, by the way, is "The G-spot doesn't exist." The G-spot. I know, it's a shock. Me too. You're tired of trying, of having to try, tired of feeling like a borderline, an unasked for sacrifice, of sticking the fingers of your soul inside to find some spot, some center in which you're sure I'm taking pleasure, even when you don't care about justice or injustice, salvation or righteousness, even when you feel like nothing, not a world or a mystery or a dog that can't bark or a dream I don't remember. You know it must be there, farther down or all around, in forests or mountains, nerves or appetites, the love I made you to discover, the part of you that feels, that knows. You're a Sabbath I keep, a prayer I answer, that your longing is my longing, your rapture my rapture, that you are my here and now, and I am your forever. And if you have it in you, I would like to read you one last one. And it's only partly because the Cosmo article is 7 empowering life lessons from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Also well worth reading, by the way. The Isaiah quote is, "Fear not, I am the one who helps you." Tikkun asked me to write something about beyond patriarchy, and I was working on the Shekhinah poems, and this was originally called Beyond Patriarchy, and I used the word patriarchy over and over again, and indeed, I don't think the Shekhinah is a fan of patriarchy, but also it felt like she had bigger fish to fry. So gradually, I realized that it wasn't patriarchy, it was really fear that she was addressing. This is called Ready. Are you ready to be strong? Are you ready to follow me beyond the fear that warns you to hold your tongue when cruelty and hopelessness, degradation and evil stab you through the heart? Fear likes you this way, self-loathing and numb, believing you're no one I'd ever choose, a worm in a tunnel, dust in a gale, a nameless pool of blood I could never love. I summon them all to judgment, the fears that stalk you to the ends of the earth, the shame and disgrace that nail you in your place, everything that gets in the way of you responding when I say, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. I was here before fear, and I'm there beyond it, opening fountains, trampling kings underfoot, calling you to me across generations by paths you haven't walked, by ways you cannot imagine. I'm the mother who really sees, the father who understands you every version, real and imagined, future and past, cypress and desert, queer fluid light, thresher of mountains, solitary pine. You have nothing to fear and nothing to prove. Are you ready to be strong? Time to remake the world. Thank you.
Wow, what a journey you've taken us on, Joy. Thank you so, so much. I think we have a few minutes for questions, comments. We may be a little gobsmacked. So if you have a question and you want to raise your hand virtually or physically, I'll be happy to call on you.
That was a whole lot.
God smacked, Amy Layfield says. You,
was that a hand from Joyce?
I see a hand from Joyce and a hand from, oh, that's a thumbs up from Alan. Yes, Joyce, please. Thanks.
I'm blown away, Joy. Brilliant, beautiful, just totally blown away. I have a question. You mentioned yesterday that psychedelics were helpful to you at some point in your life. And I'm just wondering.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. What was helpful to me?
Yeah. So yesterday, if I remember correctly, you mentioned that psychedelics were helpful at some point.
Yes.
And there's a lot been written about it. I don't have any personal experience, but I read so much about people having incredible experiences with psychedelics, microdosing, and it's just becoming a thing now. And I'm wondering what your views are, whether it's something you find useful. People talk about, having experiences, meeting God. And I'm just wondering, is that something that you find useful, and does it help you with your writing or your relationship with God?
Thank you. That was for me a really teenager thing. And the psychedelics that you're hearing about all the clinical benefits of were not what they were selling on the streets of Rochester, New York to poor teenagers. One really shudders to think about some of what I was taking. But nonetheless, psychedelics for many people offer this relief from fear. I do, and so not all of the experiences were great, but some of them were really transformative for me, and I still remember them. I remember one, I realized that I wasn't afraid, and that was the first time that I realized that I had always been afraid, that I didn't remember a time when I wasn't afraid. That's why I didn't even notice that I was afraid all the time. It was just normal for me. And suddenly I was in the world and I wasn't afraid. And I thought, oh my God, this is actually possible. And part of what went along with that was I realized that I was like holding myself so tightly so as to not let any part of my body do anything that might be construed as feminine, because I was, always terrified about that. And it was a glimpse of a larger way of being. I mean, really, like, it's not good to live in fear. And when you're not living in fear, so many other things are possible that I hadn't even realized. I do think that there was some goddish stuff. I mean, I read, because it was hard to get drugs in Rochester, New York at that time. So I did a lot of reading about psychedelics until the library got wise to me and they took the books off the shelves. But anyway, particularly the one that told you how to make LSD in your bathtub, that mysteriously disappeared. But I read the varieties of psychedelic experience, and I was waiting to have those, fabulous visions, and I wanted to see at least one or two newspaper taxis or something like that. But those weren't the kinds of trips that I had. They were more really experiences of feeling alive and aware in ways that I just had not been able to before. And I completely believe that under proper circumstances with actually good, pure stuff, that amazing things can happen, but I haven't had the experience as a grown-up.
Thanks. I want to call on Alan and then Miriam.
Alan, I am trying to read your lips, but it's not working.
So, okay, so I unmuted, but then I saw the unmute button again, so I'm not. So anyways, so this is maybe a comment and a question. So it seems that what comes from you sort of pours out in this very genuine way. And it's very different from the slam poets that I hear locally. And I went online when I was writing the intro, not surprisingly, and listened to your podcasts and your TED Talk. And I'm telling you, everything to me seems so very comforting. And not even I was thinking in my saying that in the intro, and I thought of using the phrase spiritually nurturing, but it's really comforting. And then I asked myself, comforting, is that like female, or is it feminine or masculine? And I really just think it's comforting. So here's my question for you. Do you in your work talk with young people just informally, or as a counselor in counseling, when young people are struggling with issues around transgender?
I have done that from time to time, partly because of teaching at yeshiva, and partly because I was on the map as a trans person for transitioning at yeshiva. So I was linked with Jewishness and Orthodox Judaism. And so a lot of LGBTQ people are not Jewish. Most of them are not Jewish, and many of them are inimical to any religion. And so most of my work has been in the Jewish community. And of course, I was middle-aged when I did this. So I have connected with, there have been young people who've reached out to me, but I think more middle-aged trans people have reached out to me for help with transition. But I feel very blessed when I'm able to talk with high school students or college students. It feels, and I do try to be comforting, but honest. I feel like the Shekhinah is shows how important it is that honesty go with comfort, because being comforted by somebody who's not really registering the whole truth, and somebody who doesn't necessarily know the whole truth, it's not that comforting. So maybe she's a role model in that regard. I know that I can't tell people that it always gets better and everything will be okay. In fact, I can assure them that it will not always get better and that everything won't be okay. I mean, if you're lucky enough to be a human being who lives more than a few minutes, you're going to go through all kinds of stuff. But it's worth the ride.
So I feel moved to interject, which I can do because I'm moderating, to say, Alan, I love that you said that this poetry is comforting, because on the face of it, just as you just said, Joy, you're not saying everything is hearts and flowers. This is raw and real. And I think from my pastoral perspective, what I have found is that actually reflecting back the rawness and the realness and the complexity of someone's reality, first of all, is recognizable. And second of all, that is comforting. It's like what you were saying about being seen for all of who we are. And I just want to quote my really terrible pastoral care supervisor who said one thing that I can't get out of my head after 30 years, which was reassurance doesn't reassure. And it's really true. What's reassuring is to say, here it is, all of it. And you really do that so beautifully. So thank you. Miriam.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank you, Joy. The poems are so incredibly powerful, and seeing that journey from Anna to the Shekhinah's voice was pretty astounding. And it's true, it's going to take a long time to really take it in. But one of the questions I had is, having grown up without the recognition of your I, the capital I, and finally coming to that, how does that kind of incorporate the fact that we're such a multiplicity of beings at the same time? I mean, your struggle to find that I, are you still the multiple people and does that make sense? What I'm trying to
It does, yes. There's a poem, a Shekhinah poem that I didn't read called Fragmentation that grew out of some experience that I had with trauma therapy. And the Shekhinah is like, yeah, of course you're all in pieces. Not a problem. I gotcha. I got all of them. But my trauma therapist, who also insisted that she was holding all of the pieces, said that we all have something that she called a core self, and we all do have many different parts. And when you're traumatized, a lot of times your parts sort of become semi-independent or even fully independent in order to keep something from overwhelming you. Like the core self doesn't have the resources to deal with something. So it's like on the computer when you create a virtual drive, you put a bunch of stuff on it. So the core self doesn't replace all of those things, but it does hold them in and coordinate them as a whole. And it reminds them of really of what Rabbi Dale was just saying, which is that there is this largeness, there is this wholeness, and you don't have to panic about any one or other part of it. That's like what the core self can do. So for me, I had pretty traumatizing childhood, and I was a bunch of different semi-independent parts that, but over the years since transition, this core self, which had been, there always was a core self, but because I had this false persona thing, anyway, I was split up because of the gender stuff in a lot of ways that it didn't really start to develop and mature until I was living as myself, until I had that I'm saying I to people who see the I that is really speaking here, and had the experience of everything I do is what I do. We're defined by our actions. But when I was living as a male, I told myself I wasn't. I told myself that none of what I did was me, which is very convenient if you're ethically and morally marginal, which I kind of was, like if you're not really a person, if you're not really there, then the stuff that you do doesn't really count, right? And I felt even entitled to it because I couldn't have a real I. So part of having a real core self and the sense of I has been accepting that I'm defined by all of my actions, including the ones that I'm not proud of, that I'm ashamed of, that I have to make tshuva for. So that's the way that I now understand the self. And my trauma therapist was funny. She tactfully indicated that it was unlikely that I had enough time or money to really work through all of my traumas, um, but which I think was true. But we did enough so that that experience that I lived with for a long time of feeling that I wasn't really there, I don't have to live with that anymore. I'm not sure if that totally answered the question that you were asking, but Rabbi Dale, I noticed that there are a couple of questions in the chat. Oops.
Sorry, I was muted. Would you like to respond to Marion's question about why make fun of Dr. Solomon when therapy is such a good thing sometimes?
I have had great therapists and also some bad therapists. I mean, it's been a mixed bag. But Anna makes fun of Dr. Solomon because Dr. Solomon believes in healing, believes in psychoanalysis, believes in these different discourses, as academics say, discourses being ways of talking, but really also ways of thinking, of making sense of the world. And she thinks they have all been revealed as being bullshit. So she thinks that Dr. Solomon's basic model, where she's the patient and Dr. Solomon represents this kind of integration and understanding that you can reach, and wholeness, core self, all this stuff. Anna does not have anything to do with that stuff. So she just sees Dr. Solomon as being, in a way, childlike, because that he can still believe this. Another way to see it is, because he lived through the same thing, is that that he's able to hold on to this despite what he's been through, that this is courageous, that this is a hard-won wisdom. But in the last section, she says, I wish that I could kiss you. I wish you were, I was taking the language Song of Songs, I wish you were my brother, and then would kiss you and you'd be filled with the knowledge of God and I'd be rid of it.
Mm.
Ultimately, she feels like what heals her is not Dr. Solomon, although I'm sure Dr. Solomon would see it differently, but that she's able to commune with the voices of the women who kept her alive, to experience them not just through her guilt and shame, but also to hear their love for her and to express her love for them. And in fact, the women interrupt Dr. Solomon at the end of the sequence. And so that's why it is really nothing against therapists, but Anna looks down on all of that stuff. That's her jam.
Thanks. Jean.
Jean?
Can you unmute, Jean? I think you got it. Nope. Try now.
Can hosts unmute Jean?
It's like, God and us. She's got to do it herself.
Okay.
Jean, can you unmute?
What a useful metaphor. I got to remember that. We have to unmute ourselves. God won't do it for us. Jean, you've
Jean, maybe
learned
you
how
can
to
write in
turn
the
off the
chat.
video.
Jean, can you write in the chat? while she's doing that, I just wanted to lift up a phrase that you use, Joy, that I really think is a clarion call for all of us. You talk about when I started to live as myself. And boy, you know, we all can aspire to live as ourselves. Maybe that's really the trajectory of human growth to get to that point. So another thing we can learn from the transgender journey.
It's true. Thank you.
Jean, did you manage to get unmuted? I'm so sorry.
I think we've lost her completely.
No, she moved, but she's
Oh,
there.
she's
Okay,
still-
Susan Birch, you're going to get the last question of the evening.
I can't. Okay. I want to ask you if you feel comfortable with this. It's up to you to answer this because I have challenges of my own. So I understand some of the things, but I wanted to know how long you have been transgender.
So that is a really good question. There are several different ways to answer it. I would say transgender is a very vague umbrella term, and it didn't exist for most of my life. In fact, it's a term that I'm not enamored of because it really was just the original way of saying non-binary. Non-binary takes the gender part out of it, but basically saying you're transgender is saying you have a relation to gender and identity that's too complicated to simply say I'm a man or a woman or something like that. So in terms of identifying myself, I think not that long. I was resistant to it, and then I realized, well, you know, this is what the Team T is calling ourselves these days. And then I started to realize that there were advantages to this because identifying myself as transgender was saying my particular idiosyncratic journey really is connected to a lot of people who are very different than me, but we're still connected in some way. So I started to, I sort of got on board with that. But for most of my life, I didn't have that category. And so I wouldn't say that I was transgender. But I don't have a memory of myself where I didn't identify as female. And I know that when in my earliest childhood, that wasn't a problem. So I didn't experience myself as being trans anything. I just identified as female. But I didn't realize that that was complicated until my first day of preschool. And on my first day of preschool, I tried to play with my natural peer group, the girls. And the girls, preschoolers can be fiercely binary. They, you know, a boy is coming over to us. The boy must be chasing us. And so they all giggled and laughed and ran away. And I thought, well, okay, I got here a little late. We're playing some kind of weird game. So I tried to go join them again, and they did the same thing. And then they said, you're trying to kiss us. You're trying to kiss us. And I'm like, I am totally lost. You know, I wasn't that late to class. So I didn't realize that they saw me as something different. But I know that out of that experience, I started to realize that the way people saw me from the outside didn't fit the way I saw myself from the inside. And by the time I was in first grade, I was really in the closet. I was trying to maintain a male facade. I didn't call it that, but I I felt terrified lest anybody discovered that I wasn't really the boy that they knew I was. So I would say at that point, I had a transgender identity in the sense that I knew that I didn't fit into the binary gender world that was all around me, but I wasn't transgender in the sense that I didn't know there was anyone else like me. So I thought that this was just some strange thing about me. I thought maybe maybe I'm not human. Maybe I came up with all of these, kids with crazy ideas. I was briefly enamored of the idea that I was an alien. This was coincided with the first run of Star Trek. We had a black and white TV, and Mr. Spock was really cool. And I thought, okay, that's good. Being an alien could work for me here. But I didn't have the ears, and so being a young child, I realized, no, I can't be a Vulcan. So then I learned the word transsexual, and I identified for a long time as a transsexual, which is a word that now sets many people's teeth on edge, which is the way I feel about tranny, which is the word that other people of my generation identify with for reasons I can't imagine, but they do. That's their word. And I didn't want to let go of transsexual because it was my word. It was the first word that I had that named me as I was. And it's not a great word for different reasons, but it's specific, it's precise. And so that's why I resisted identifying as transgender, because it felt like I'm giving up a way to name my relation to binary gender in favor of a vaguer term that connects me with more people, but many of whom are quite different. Did that make sense, Susan?
Yes, thank you. I hope you didn't mind me asking. I hope you
That
didn't
she
mind.
hopes that you didn't mind that she asked that.
Oh no, of course not. I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Okay.
No, there was nothing wrong. No, that was great.
Thank you for coming. I want to thank you. I get Jewish family and career services, so a lot of people are familiar with you. So thank you very much.
You're so welcome.
And I want to thank you, Joy, on behalf of all of us. We are so privileged to have been taken on this phantasmagorical tour of the human and the divine and the terrifying intimacy between us. Thank you. I want to remind everybody that we're not done with Joy. Somehow she's going to rest overnight. And at 9:30, she's going to join us at the community school at the Friends School Atlanta for Minyan B'Yachad. And she's going to be talking with our kids about God, which will be amazing, something that happens far too seldom. And then at 10:15, she's going to be talking about parenting, the G word, parenting in a gender diverse world, I believe is something like the title. So that's going to be in person, but also on Zoom. Please feel free to join us. If the links don't work, we'll make them work. Don't give up. And
it is the same link tomorrow as it is today.
It is the same link. Fabulous. And Shavua Tov to everybody. And again, Joy, thank you from the bottoms of our hearts.
Oh, thank you all.
Yes. Tomorrow will be multi-access, in person and virtual.
Wow.
Wow is right. Good night, everybody.
Good night.